the people who identify as left in the United States will need to define what it is. It needs to be anti-imperialist. I think it needs to be socialist. And it also needs to, as there is more activity, whether you're in the information, education sphere, you're in the activist organization sphere, wherever you are, taking a note to build leadership that can bring people to a higher level of understanding and therefore action. Because one of the frustrating things, and I say this all the time, and I hesitate to say it sometimes now because of how urgent the Palestine question is, but it can be true too that in the Palestine solidarity movement, there's not a lot of attention and focus on, well, how to stop the war machine generally, when there seems to be an incredible opportunity to do so. So while I do think, of course, this is a moment to put forth the demands, or maybe a single demand like a ceasefire out there to make it happen and to win, in the background, we got to do a lot of work to make sure that the people who are out there can find spaces and places to go where they can learn and understand and take maybe even more assertive and broader action on the fact that Palestine is a byproduct. What's going on in Palestine is a byproduct of this larger war machine, which, if it's not doing it in Palestine, it's going to do it somewhere else, and it's doing it elsewhere, right? I mean, there's a long history. We can go country after country after country, people after people after people who have experienced what Palestine is going through right now.
But for those of us who are in the belly of the beast, as they say, is within the empire, those of us who are in the collective left of the West, what do you think can be improved among us? Because, and I ask this question is because trying to get the left in the West, especially in the United States, to cohesively go together into a better direction, a more progressive direction, is like herding cats. What do you think is the, I don't want to say just the problem, but I think what in your thoughts is the solution for the collective West so that we can move in a more cohesive fashion?
We are going to be here for a while. We should tell your audience.
Right.
We should all tell your audience that we're going to be here for the entire weekend. It'll be a weekend well spent. It's kind of like a retreat. I guess we're going on a little retreat because, that's a big question. I mean, that certainly we could probably write many books on the answer to that question.
Yeah.
But I guess I'll say, in terms of the left, reviving the left, it's really going to take, I think, number one, defining what that is. I mean, for me, the left is anti-imperialist. The left inevitably has to be socialist, meaning inevitably has to be about bringing power to the people being directly involved in determining their destinies, and not just any people, but those who are the most downtrodden and oppressed among us, generally the working class, and the most impoverished, most exploited sections of the globe. So inevitably, for me, that's kind of like where the left has to be. Of course, there's a lot of contradictions that have to be addressed. There's the question of race. I mean, we're seeing that now with the rise of Zionism back into the forefront of the picture. I mean, is there anything more tragic than what has happened to the working class around the world than Zionism? I mean, there was a time where working class Jews all over the world stood for many, many, many things. And then when Zionism came around, it was a really convenient escape valve to destroy that tradition. And that's just fact. I mean, I'm married to a Jewish woman. I've studied that history, the labor movement in the United States, for example. There's a long history. The Soviet Union, for example, was a huge, the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, but they also defeated the pogroms and the widespread anti-Semitism that was just endemic to the semi-feudal czarist regime before the Soviet Union came to be. So there was this tradition on the left and on the Jewish left in particular of really standing for peace and standing in solidarity with other oppressed groups. And Zionism was a really not just convenient, but an intentional way to kind of destroy that legacy, divide it up, carve it up, and literally do so, of course, as always has been throughout the history of Western so-called civilization, is to carve things up, carve land up, and then, of course, to divide and conquer oppressed people all over. So Zionism is one of the biggest examples of that. So, of course, we have to address that because that still comes up to this day. I mean, when we think about how most people in the collective West, even amongst the left, react to attempts to counter, for example, the Russophobia or the xenophobia, the anti-China, anti-Russia rhetoric and policy coming out of Washington, coming out of NATO, coming out of the West, you get a lot of pushback still. I mean, public opinion in the United States and in the West in general has been turned for the worst against two rising powers that inevitably are not just important, but also will it just is the truth. They're going to be the leaders of this planet for quite some time to come. So we might not want to go to war with them, especially since they are both nuclear armed. And why are they nuclear armed? Because in their history, they've had to become nuclear armed because, well, there was a time where the United States was always threatening a kind of nuclear war against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to show the Soviet Union that it could do that. China built nuclear weapons in 1964. Why did it do it in 1964? Well, because over that 15-year period after its revolution, there were multiple times where China was threatened with nuclear weapons. And of course, right on its border, where it had to volunteer millions of people to fight on behalf of Korea against a U.S. invasion, the U.S. threatened nuclear war over Korea. So China needed nuclear weapons. So China has nuclear weapons, Russia's nuclear weapons. They've had a history of needing them. And the reason is because the United States has used them and they threaten them. And so it's really important, I think, just on that level alone, but there's so many other elements to it to combat xenophobia, Russophobia, especially in this moment. And so the solution, I think, especially in terms of building, maybe we should focus on an anti-imperialist left, is to start developing connections, people to people exchanges. That's something I'm really focused on now, building people to people exchanges. It just so happens that a lot of the geopolitics community are people who live all over the world anyway, so that's helpful. But
Yeah.
in terms of, for example, China, it is going to be really important in the coming years for more and more, especially Americans, but even Europeans, because that has also died down a lot. But especially, it's mainly Americans who need this, mainly people who live in the United States who need this. They need to go, they need to meet Chinese people, they need to understand China better, because if they don't, it's going to be much easier for China to be demonized in this way and for people to believe it. So, people to people exchanges is critical. Of course, I think first, what's going to need to happen is that in moments like, for example, what's happening right now, there are two major geopolitical crises. There's Ukraine and there's the, of course, situation in Gaza, the Israeli massacre that's going on, the genocide. In both instances, it's really important that neither of them are looked at in a vacuum, because that's often what happens when people get charged up. And right now, it's beautiful to see all across the West, including the United States, hundreds of thousands, millions of people going to the streets in solidarity with Palestinians, in solidarity with Palestine, demanding a ceasefire, demanding an end to occupation. All of those things are very good. The problem, though, that happens, and this is true also in analysis of Ukraine, because a lot of people hyper focus on Ukraine, and we should. It's a really important war. I mean, it literally World War III could happen in a snap because of what the United States is doing in Ukraine. So surely we should focus on it and put a laser focus on it. But sometimes what happens is that because Ukraine is this trench warfare, it's like a World War I style war where you have a battlefield with a front line where you have hundreds of thousands of troops going and fighting at this front line, big weapons, big tanks. It really gets people who are interested in warfare as a area of study interested. And then, of course, there's the politics of it, which are equally as, I think, enticing in terms of entertainment and to,
Yeah.
and also in terms of shock value. Like, it is shocking that the United States and NATO are trying to poke the Russian bear to a degree that could lead to a war between the two, between the United States, NATO, and Russia on the other side. So, yes, it's really important to focus on that. However, when we can't see that there is interest behind this, there's an objective behind this, and that it's connected to all other global developments, like everything the United States does to contain Russia, to try to commit regime change against Russia. That is connected, for example, to what's going on in Syria. That's connected to what's happening all over the African continent. This
Yeah.
Cold War is about destroying any possibility for global solidarity and global integration independent of the United States and independent of the collective West. That's what it's all about. And Russia and China just happen to be the biggest pieces, but it's hard to connect that if we are just so laser focused and almost looking at each geopolitical development as some kind of area study. But the reality is that what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Ukraine is a byproduct of an empire in decline that is attempting to maintain what it has, maintain all that it has stolen, all that it has attempted to usurp from nations and people around the world. And it's an attempt to get rid of the alternative to that, which means expansion, but it also means legitimately trying to get rid of quote unquote threats. You know, it's not just the China threat. China is not a threat. I actually say that actually China is a threat, but it's not for the reasons that you hear about in the media. Russia is a threat, but not for the reasons you hear about in the media. Russia is not a threat to the US's existence or the Western way of life or any of that. But Russia and China represent an alternative, which therefore forces the United States and NATO to prove their legitimacy. And guess what? When you have choices, you might make a different one. And that's what's happening all across the world, Africa,
Yeah.
Latin America. They're making different choices. They're saying, okay, well, we've gone through decades, if not centuries, of being under the gun and thumb of the
Yeah.
West. Why wouldn't we work with Russia and China when they're on the rise, when their economies are offering more, when Russia has state-of-the-art military assistance, China has state-of-the-art infrastructure and economic development assistance? Why wouldn't we work with them? It doesn't mean we reject the United States, which is true in Latin America, most of Latin America, most of Africa, most of Asia. They're not rejecting the United States out of hand, because that often comes with consequences. But they're saying we want choices, we want diversification, we want sovereignty, and China and Russia are respectful of that. In the United States, and of course its European so-called allies, are not. And so we, I think, need to highlight that contradiction more. I think if the Western left, or the left in the West, maybe we should call it, because the Western left, I think at this point, is a slur, because of how terrible it is. But people who identify as left in the United States will need to define what it is. It needs to be anti-imperialist. I think it needs to be
Yeah.
socialist. And it also needs to, as there is more activity, whether you're in the information, education sphere, you're in the activist organization sphere, wherever you are, taking a note to build leadership that can
Yeah.
bring people to a higher level of understanding and therefore action. Because one of the frustrating things, and I say this all the time, and I hesitate to say it sometimes now because of how urgent the Palestine question is, but
Yeah.
it can be true too that in the Palestine solidarity movement, there's not a lot of attention and focus on, well, how to stop the war machine generally, when there seems to be an incredible opportunity to do so. So
Mm.
while I do think, of course, this is a moment to put forth the demands, or maybe a single demand like a ceasefire out there to make it happen and to win, in the background, we got to do a lot of work to make sure that the people who are out there can find spaces and places to go where they can learn and understand and take maybe even more assertive and broader action on the fact that Palestine is a byproduct. What's going on in Palestine is a byproduct of this larger war machine, which, if it's not doing it in Palestine, it's going to do it somewhere else, and it's doing it elsewhere, right? I mean, there's a long history. We can go country after country after country, people after people
Yeah.
after people who have
Yeah.
experienced what Palestine is going through right now.
Yeah.
So uh, I think that's probably the most urgent thing to do. And we can't do it all as individuals, getting back to that individualism question. So finding a way to harness and focus. I called it discipline, because some people are saying, don't get too emotional because people are getting slaughtered in Palestine. I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of a messed up thing to ask of people. I think people are going to get angry. They're going to get sad. They're probably going to be traumatized a little bit, because I'm also a therapist. And I know that if you witness something that will give you PTSD, oftentimes people get PTSD. So that's a real thing. So it's kind of hard to
I've
ask
been
people
there
not to be
before.
emotional. It's also hard to just tell people just be to be logical only, because that means you have to divorce a part of yourself that
Your
can be
humanity,
quite
yeah.
helpful. Anger is quite helpful, right? Like oftentimes when we get angry about something, we kind of do something, right? Like, or we feel backed up against the wall because something is so horrific. We
Yeah.
generally want to do something about it. So we shouldn't also just be logical, but I think we need to try to find ways to
Be
unite
balanced.
the two together, and I call that more discipline. Like that's discipline, right? To be able to bring them together. It's not easy. I can't claim to be perfect at it. I can't claim to be even that good at it, but I call it discipline because it means that we can both take concerted action. We can also analyze and think about a situation clearly, and we can also feel what we need to feel to move us into action. It's never going to be 100%
Yeah.
pure or true, but I think in a
Mhm.
situation like we're in now globally, where the threat of a global war, whether it's in West Asia because of what Israel is doing, or whether it's because of what NATO is doing, Ukraine, or what the United States is doing in the Asia Pacific to encircle China, wherever it is, that's kind of giving us this energy to be like, oh, well, that's messed up. We need to stop it, to be able to both feel what we need to feel and also study and build an understanding, and also and be able to harness that action to something meaningful and something that we find to be a contribution. And that's all I think the left in the West can do at this moment, because it's going to take a lot of work, because it's the conditions right now are so that we are not in a position of strength at the moment. I think it's beautiful and powerful, all these protests for Palestine, but Washington isn't moving on this issue. So that shows that we are in a position where power is still kind of far away. So we need to build up forces that over time are prepared to take that power that's necessary to get the things done that we demand and we scream on the streets about. Like, if we want a ceasefire right now, well, the question is, how do we build the power necessary to force that to happen, or maybe get the power necessary to do that ourselves? Like, maybe we can't rely on the Pentagon, on the State Department, on a presidential administration at the head, commanding and chiefing a war machine, a machine that's dedicated to waging war for dominance, for profits, for hegemony, for those things that have nothing to do with our interests.